Shalom to everyone. Good day to all our many participants from across Canada. My name is Dina Wachtel, and on behalf of myself and my co-host, Ayala Davis, and all our colleagues here at Canadian Friends of the Hebrew University, we want to welcome you to this webinar. And before we begin, I would like to give a special shout out to our friend from Montreal and a longtime member of our board there and supporter, Carol Koffler, who is celebrating her birthday today. Carol, from all of your friends at Canadian Friends of HUJI and Hebrew, we wish you Mazal Tov and send you our love and continued good health. Now it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar in which we will be discussing with our esteemed speaker, Professor Janice Stein, the topic of where our world is headed after this pandemic. Today, our format will be a little bit different. We have the pleasure of having Ronnie Appleby, our past chair of the National Board of Canadian Friends of Hebrew, who will introduce Professor Stein and then begin the conversation with a couple of questions of his own, after which we will open the floor to you, our audience, for your questions. Just a quick reminder, to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box anytime throughout this discussion, but please also raise your hand by clicking on the digital hand at the bottom of your screen so we can unmute your mic. Ronnie, please take it away.
Thank you, friends, Canadian Friends of Hebrew University, all our friends. So I'm going to introduce Janice, and normally it would take a long time to properly introduce her. I'm going to try to leave time for some questions and answers and a presentation by Janice. Whether it's economics, geopolitics, or international security and terrorism, no one has a better understanding of global issues than Professor Janice Gross-Stein. She has degrees from McGill and Yale and has been a professor at U of T since 1982. Janice is the founder and former director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at U of T and is the Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management and Negotiation in the Department of Political Science. She has the Order of Canada, Order of Ontario, is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and many other honors and awards. She has written numerable outstanding books and articles and is a regular on television. Among her many honorary doctorates is one from Hebrew University of Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, throughout her career, Professor Stein has taken very close interest in the advancement of Hebrew University. She was a guiding force in the establishment of the Halbert Center for Canadian Studies at the Hebrew University and has been tireless in her efforts to forge strong and long-lasting academic ties between Hebrew U and U of T. Her dynamic presentation will provide a unique perspective on what is really happening around the world and what it means to you, our audience. We will take a look at where things are headed where the potential dangers and opportunities may lie. We will be left, I'm sure, with a better understanding of the issues we are facing and a clear view of the future. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions. The topic, just to remind everybody, is where is our world headed after COVID-19? First question is, how has this pandemic, COVID-19, changed the world? Janice?
Well, thank you very much, Ronnie, for that really warm introduction. So kind of you. You promised everyone who's in the webinar today that they would leave with a clearer understanding. I'm going to disappoint everybody because we are at a time really deep uncertainty. And it would be less than honest of me if I pretended that that was not the case. You know, this is almost an unprecedented event in the lifetime of most of us on this webinar. The last really devastating pandemic that we had was 100 years ago in the Spanish flu. Yes, we've lived with HIV/AIDS and we've seen Ebola in the Congo and other African countries, and we had swine flu. And certainly for the people, particularly HIV/AIDS, who lived with that epidemic, it was even more devastating than this one. But it didn't sweep into the broad community as a whole in the same way. And what people are saying now, when they ask the question that you asked me, you get the answer from many, many people, both in government, leaders of the private sector, and they say, well, this changes everything. Well, we know that's wrong. This does not change everything. Then there's a group of people who say, well, this changes nothing. And once we get a vaccine, we're all going to go back to life as it was before. Well, we know that's wrong. So answers at both extremes, which assumes certainty that everything is going to change or that nothing is going to change, I know are wrong. So the interesting question becomes then, and here's where all the debates are, what is likely to revert back to normal and what is likely to really change? So let's start with a few that are likely to really change. I think everybody in Canada and in Israel, there's very much the same feeling. They're shocked that governments were caught unprepared, without enough masks, enough ventilators, enough personal protective equipment, what we call PPE, for frontline healthcare workers who had to deal with the surge of cases that they encountered. Some are very low tech. Masks, ventilators a little harder. And out of this, I think, comes a conversation which is happening everywhere around, and here's the word that's been used, resilience, which really means what are areas of strategic importance to the country? And where do we need, therefore, strategic reserves so that the next big crisis that we face, we will not find ourselves, you know, on the tarmacs and airfields with suitcases full of cash, trying to buy masks and gowns and gloves and the other equipment that people need, and because that's really what went on. Coming out of this pandemic, I think governments will have to decide what is strategic. So, and we haven't had that conversation yet in Canada, but we will. It's starting. Beyond the kinds of basic medical supplies. This one is a viral pandemic. It could have easily has been a bacterial infection that spread, and yet every single antibiotic across the spectrum, a component of every antibiotic is manufactured in China. Are we comfortable with that? What governments and businesses will be faced with? Will we allow a single point of distribution to continue to operate in strategic sectors? Why did we do this, we might ask? We did this because we got the best quality product at the lowest possible price. Anybody who's in business who is listening will understand that over the last 25 years, we moved to a just-in-time delivery system. We don't stock inventory. We're confident that what we need, and these are the global supply chains that we talk about, we will source from everywhere in the world, and wherever the business is, that will make it cheapest and best. It's both, it's quality and price. that's where that business will enter into the supply chain. And some of the things we use can have 100 companies in 50 different countries in that global supply chain. That part of globalization will change after this pandemic. How big is that strategic envelope? So you might say, well, crucial medical supplies. Do you go on and you say, food supply? Do we have to secure our own food supply? Should we have enough in a reserve to produce the meat products that we need, the dairy products that we need? Right? Is that part of what's essential and strategic for us as a country? Take it one level further. What if the next crisis is a climate-induced crisis? What do we need in the strategic reserve to protect our citizens against extreme weather that is predicted by almost every climatologist? So what is coming next is different from what was before, in that governments are going to be held to account to provide and to make sure that strategic essentials are available in an emergency, but Canadians are going to pay much more for that than they have in the past. That's one big change. Second thing that is not going to change are many of those global supply chains that have developed over these last 25 years. So for example, toy manufacturing will not return to Canada because the cost of labor in Canada is too high. Look at the shoes you're all wearing. If you're wearing shoes in your homes right now, where were they made? Very likely, except I know of one Canadian shoemaker who's developed a global brand, but most have not. And most of the shoes that we wear come from low-cost, low-wage countries that export shoes to Canada. That will continue. So people who say globalization is over as a result of this are not right. And people who say globalization will continue as it did before are not right. That's probably the most honest but shaded answer I can give you to that question, Ronnie.
That's a great answer. I mean, basically, we're saying that things that are required for security, and they won't be globalized.
They will be much less globalized, that's right.
And things that are sort of everyday, the shoes and so forth, will be.
That's right.
They'll continue to be.
That's right. That's right.
That's very fundamental.
And you know, Ronnie, what do we mean by required for security, right? Well, traditionally, we answered that question, well, you needed helicopters and you needed frigates and you needed a search and rescue capability. But we might mean much more now, right? We've broadened that category of security. And people who follow the news in Israel know that the Mossad was dispatched to buy masks. That's not something that the Mossad had ever done before, but it tells us that our concept of security is now broadening to include much more within it than it used to.
Wow. Okay, let's continue. So as we move into the recovery, what are the big risks that we are facing?
The risks, you know, again, it's important to be balanced as we think of this. I think the risks are obvious to most of us when we think about this. Whether we call this, what we are in right now, a recession or a depression, it's just a question of language, but we have the largest number of unemployed since the depression in the 1930s. And that's been forced, right? It's been forced because business closed down across the country in order to prevent our healthcare system from being swamped. when you have this kind of unemployment and this kind of shock to the system, what happens normally is demand gets dampened. I don't know about your friends, but I've had some conversations with mine. When do you next plan on going on vacation? And people think that question is absolutely bizarre right now, right? So a demand that was very much part of our society even 3 months ago is now gone. Nobody even wants to talk about that, much less pay for one in advance. And that's frankly why our government has intervened in our economy to the extent that it has. It is moved in to support businesses to prevent layoffs, further layoffs, to prevent businesses from going bankrupt, and to provide enough cash for people so that demand doesn't sink even further. But we have a little window into the future here. When we watch what's happening in China. China was, as we all know, 2 to 2.5 months ahead of us. It has now opened its economy. Workers are back. The factories are working, but Chinese consumers are not buying. So even when they're out of their homes and they're collecting salaries, the shock of what happened is so intense for many people, and especially for younger ones who have no memory of any disaster like this, that I think there is a prolonged period of depressed consumer demand in front of us. So you may have gathered that I do not think that we're going to have what we call a V-shaped recovery, where as soon as they let us out, the economy will boom with repressed demand. I think we're in for a minimum 12 to 18 months of a very slow stop and go economy, where the risks of what Japan has experienced. And Lawrence Summers, the former president of Harvard and the Secretary of the Treasury, was the first one to use this expression. He talked about secular stagnation, right? Well, that is where demand is low. Productivity doesn't really grow even with the low demand. And of course, the fact that we are, like every other rich country in the world, a society that is getting older. Look at the color of your hair, look at the color of mine, we're getting older. We buy less when we're in this age group than we did when we were younger, had young families. And that's the period of maximum demand for goods and services. So people are worried, I know, about inflation. I'm worried far more about a prolonged period of stagnation, which can leave, we had that in the 70s, and that can leave people pretty unhappy. I think that's a big risk. An opportunity. For each risk in this conversation, I'm going to try to provide an opportunity. We've been talking for at least 5 years now about the increasing likelihood of digitizing and automating our economies. All of us are having a discussion today, which even 4 months ago, the Canadian Friends probably would have not have done this way. We would have got together in a large room, we would have had a speaker, and there would have been Q&A that was person to person. We've digitized now the way we gather, and that's just a foretaste of digitization and automation of our economy. We have 3 large packing plants, meat packing plants in Canada only. That's all. And in one of the largest plants in Alberta, in Cargill, Alberta, because meat packers, the people who are doing the work, are standing too close together, large numbers of cases of COVID-19. They could not separate themselves the way the plant was set up. I can guarantee you within 2 years, that plant will be automated. Fewer jobs, but robots don't get sick from viruses. And that has been a very significant worry for people. What happens in an age of automation as more and more jobs are done by fewer and fewer people and robots take over more and more? Well, our government in the last 2 months, literally overnight, put in place the fundamentals of what we call a guaranteed annual income, where everybody who lost their job or can talk about the economic harm they've experienced from this gets a check for $2,000. That's a guaranteed annual income. It would probably have taken 10 more years of debate to get there. We got there overnight. And one of the really interesting questions, will the government roll that back and say this is just a crisis measure? Or has this changed the way we think about our social support system? Because automation is only going to increase, not decrease. Will that guaranteed annual income, $2,000 a month, $24,000 a year, is not going to allow anybody to live in luxury in Canada, especially not in our cities. But it will change the way we think about poverty supports. It will think the way we change about social supports. It's going to be fascinating to see what our government does over these next 6 to 12 months. That may be one of the fundamental changes that comes out of this pandemic.
So you've addressed the risk and the opportunity. So what are there other opportunities that you see coming out of this situation?
Oh, you know, for sure. History tells us over and over and over again, in every war, in every natural disaster, in every not only pandemic illness, there are always those who do what Wayne Gretzky, the greatest Canadian ever, said, who skated to where the puck was going, not where the puck was. That's probably the most brilliant insight about leadership that we could have. Our economy has just, and our society has just had a shock to the system, which has enabled us to leapfrog over 10 years. We are moving now into a fully digitized economy, digitized society, digital education system. Every business will be much more digitized a year from now than it was 2 or 3 months from now. So businesses, universities, hospitals that understand that digitization is the wave of the future, the ones that lead and get out in front of where the puck is going, will be leaders in the new economy and the new society we're going to. Let me give you just one example, which is probably meaningful to many of you. We've been talking for 10 years about digitizing healthcare delivery. No, we can't do it. We can't do it. Privacy, technology is no good. Almost everybody's GP over the last general practitioner, family doctor, you've probably been in contact with yours for one reason or another. Some do it by Zoom, some do it by email, some do it by phone, but they've discouraged us from coming into their offices for good reason. And we now have the ability to deliver healthcare in a primary care setting in a radically different way than we did 7 or 8 weeks ago. Hopefully, that doesn't go away.
Thank you. Thank you, Ronnie. We would like to open the floor to questions from our audience. I'm reminding you again to click on the digital hand at the bottom for us to identify you. We have hundreds of participants, and without that, we cannot identify you. So I'll read the first question from Gadi Meir. The virus is exaggerating the income divide. Will we see a new rash of violence and social unrest?
That's a really great question, because the virus has exaggerated the income divide. We don't have good data in Canada, Gabby. It's very interesting because in Canada, we cannot collect data on race or other indicators, economic and social indicators that would tell us. But anecdotally, that's what we're hearing again and again. The story is visible in the United States. African Americans who live in poor sections of big cities are far more severely afflicted by the virus than those who live in affluent suburbs. And you can map this as they have in the United States. You can literally, the disparities are, you can see them, frankly. So will that fuel anger in those communities that are really badly afflicted? Of course it will. And it should, because the virus has made these disparities so much more dramatic. Now again, on the other hand, what has also become obvious to all of us, that very low paid workers, personal support workers, who work in long-term care homes across this country, who were working in 2 different homes because they were not getting a living wage when they only worked in one, and were working 2 shifts a day, are on the front lines of this crisis, putting their lives at risk. Many Canadians are saying, this is not all right. These people are doing work that most of us and most Canadians will not do. We need to raise the wages of personal support workers to a decent wage so they are not forced to go and work in more than one of these long-term care homes at a time. People who stock grocery shelves. Check out people in groceries. These are low paid workers, and yet they were called essential workers. I think coming out of this crisis, there will be a general willingness on the part of Canadians to pay for more, to pay for decent salaries for people who enabled each and every one of us to keep going during these last 7 weeks, and probably for weeks more, at some real risk and cost to themselves. You know, I've heard the discussion about long-term care homes. What's really interesting is we all knew, we just didn't say, but the virus has now shone a bright spotlight on the below the poverty line wages that we were paying people to look after our elderly in our society. I think that will change. I think that will change. So yes, we have to be mindful of the anger that those who have suffered disproportionately because of poverty will feel. And we have to do something about inadequate housing, about slum conditions, about a label we call density, which just means crowded into substandard housing. That's going to be a challenge for all rich, developed societies, not to perpetuate these conditions. If we give people hope, there will not be violence. If people feel absolutely hopeless coming out of this, that their situation will improve, then you grow the risk of civil violence.
Thank you. We have a question from Stephen Lipper.
Hi, Steve. That's an old friend of mine. So nice to hear from you.
Stephen, can you unmute yourself? Okay, I will read the question. How will this affect Israel and its neighbors in the aftermath, also considering the collapse in oil prices?
So those are 2 really interesting questions. I'm sure you've noticed that the outbreak, the number of cases in Gaza is extremely low, which is astonishing. because Gaza is the most dense, one of the most densely crowded places on earth, with frankly a really substandard health infrastructure. So if you were just looking at this, you would ask yourself, how is it possible that the number of cases, I don't think there are 100 cases yet in Gaza. And it's not only that they're not being tested, because there would be a count if there were people dying from the virus, but the death rate is extremely low. So how is that possible? This bewildered many, many people, not only Gaza, but generally speaking, the lower incidence in many societies. In Gaza's case, the explanation is very clear, and it's low in the West Bank as well. Not as low as Gaza, but it's low in the West Bank as well. It's because there's very little, Gaza is walled off. There's no in and out traffic, frankly, or very limited. There are no carriers of the virus coming in from outside to Gaza, as there was, for example, to Canada, where somebody came from China and then from Europe, and that's where the infection spread from. And because it is such a contained society, the virus incidence is very low. There has actually been cooperation, both with the Palestine Authority and with Hamas, to manage the virus, to provide supplies, and this has been a period of extraordinary quiet, frankly, both between the Palestine Authority and Israel and Gaza, and on the northern borders with Lebanon and Syria in particular, because these societies are consumed, everyone, with trying to manage and deal with the virus. Whether it's possible to build on that coming out of this, again, there's opportunity, but it requires leadership. It requires leadership on all sides to recognize that this is an opportunity and that it may be possible to seize the moment and to build, at least in some directions, a better way to go forward. There is, as you know, a new coalition government in Israel. It will take time, but it would require on all sides an extraordinary act of leadership for this to be more than just a pause as all these societies struggle with the virus. The collapse in the oil price is dramatic. It grows out of one long-term demand, which was accentuated. Again, what the crisis has done in so many cases is shine a spotlight on what was happening before. There was a drop in demand, but of course, when business shut down, societies shut down, the demand for oil fell off the edge. So we had at one point oil that was $7 or $8 a barrel. Most of the countries in the Middle East need the price of a barrel of oil to be between $50 and $60 a barrel of oil for their economies to sustain themselves without major disruption. We are far from that right now. And there is a risk of regime failure, regime collapse in countries like Saudi Arabia, which finance social entitlements entirely out of oil revenues. Iraq, which is already very fragile, finances its budget and its everything it does from oil revenues, which will be, again, a long time in recovering as economies open up gradually, slowly, but demand does not come charging back as many had hoped. You look at Alberta, in our own country to the west, where oil was landlocked, unable really to export to Asia, where the demand was high, only to the United States, where Alberta sells oil at a discounted price. But with this dramatic drop in the price of oil, and the shutdown of the Alberta economy. I think Alberta is facing a crisis like no other province in this country, and like none it has known in its history, frankly. So that's a long-winded way of saying that economies that depend on the export of oil have an additional shock to the system on top of the shock of the pandemic, which is going to complicate them. There are many Middle Eastern analysts who are worrying about regime collapse in different parts of the Middle East.
Thank you. We have a question from Moshe Ben Shlomo. Go ahead, Moshe. Okay, he writes, hi Janice, how do you think countries around the world will treat China if indeed it will be proven that they either invented the virus or made crucial mistakes in the way they handled it?
So we're already seeing a backlash against China. And there are the two variants of the story. One is indisputably true, that China made crucial mistakes in the way it handled the virus. Had they disclosed fully, even 3 weeks earlier, it is possible that it could have been contained and not become a global pandemic. And that is a conclusion not reached by President Trump and the people around him in the White House, but by epidemiologists who have no motive to politicize what is already a toxic relationship. There is, of course, the unproven allegation that the virus was created in a lab or being studied in a lab, and that somehow it escaped a lab. There's absolutely no hard evidence for that. There have been epidemiologists and WHO teams that went to China. That's partly explains how the WHO behaved, and they saw no evidence whatsoever. And in the intelligence community right now, particularly in the United States, they are mounting an all-out effort to see if they can find any evidence. And much to the president's displeasure, they have not been able to find it. I don't think it's necessary, frankly. I think it's a red herring story, because there's no question that China suppressed information for 3 weeks, which was critical to the security of the rest of the world. There is an all-out propaganda war now between China and the United States. China alleging that its performance is superior. It looks at the death rate and the mismanagement of the pandemic, which is really, frankly, shocking in the United States, claims its system is superior, and it has engaged in corona diplomacy. It has supplied masks and PPE and ventilators to many friendly countries. The United States has alleged that China is responsible for the pandemic that we're facing. And when we look at polls of countries in Europe and in parts of Asia, we are seeing popular anger against the Chinese government for this. This comes in the larger context of an unraveling of the relationship between China and the United States. This started not under President Trump. There was already a tense relationship when Obama was president, but it has accelerated dramatically. There was a trade war, which is frozen for now, but the tariffs remain in place. And I think that is another change that comes out of the pandemic, a much more adversarial and much more hostile relationship between China and the United States, which puts small countries in a difficult position. Israel has grappled with this. Israel allowed Chinese company to come in, as you know, and manage the civilian port in Haifa. The United States protested vigorously that its fleet docked and told the government of Israel in no uncertain terms that it would not feel secure about its fleet being that close to the part of the port that was managed and is managed by a Chinese company. Israel finds itself, like almost everybody else, caught, and so are we in this country, as we all know, We have an executive of Huawei that is under house arrest, and we have 2 Canadians that are in jail, held hostage as a result of this crisis. So everybody but the biggest of the big will now have to navigate a world that is structured by a deep rivalry between China and the United States. And that rivalry extends across every sector: economy, politics, the military, technology. It is an all-encompassing rivalry.
Thank you. We have a question from Michael Halbert.
Hi, Michael.
Would you like to ask it, Michael? Unmute yourself. Okay, what qualities of national leadership should we be looking for to address future same-level crises, assuming we may not be able to guess their nature of origin? Furthermore, while we admire democracy, is it the best system with which to address these issues?
So 2 really good questions. What kind of leadership are we looking for? We're looking for leadership, it seems to me. I think the countries that will do best coming out of this country will have leaders with 2 qualities. First of all, a capacity to think strategically, to look at the future and to understand that not all options are available, and that they are going to have to make some very difficult choices. And secondly, these leaders have to have the courage to be honest and to talk directly to their publics and to say quite dramatically, these are hard times that we're facing. And we're going to have to make choices that will not please everybody. But we need your support and your understanding as we move to reshape our strategy in a much more uncertain world. If we have timid leaders who try to avoid making choices, and we all know who those leaders are, I don't have to name them. If we have people who do not speak with integrity and honesty to their publics about the choices that we confront, I think countries that are afflicted with those kinds of leaders will not do well. Our democracy is best able to manage these kinds of crises. It's very interesting. If you actually look at what happened in China beginning in December, when the first case of coronavirus was identified. And very quickly in the city of Wuhan, local doctors became aware that something extraordinary was happening. They were seeing cases, really terrible pneumonia that they had not had experience in treating. And a few of them spoke out on social media. And then, as we all know, they were repressed by, there's no dispute about this, by the government of China. They were silenced. The biggest failing of autocracies is they shut off needed information, information that they need in a timely way in order to make really good decisions. I think if the leadership in Beijing had been fully aware of how grave the situation was in Wuhan, they would have moved much more dramatically. But because the system discourages speaking out, discourages whistleblowing, discourages dissenters, the government itself is deprived of information that they need. So I know people are critical, especially of what happens and is happening in the United States, but look at Canada. Look at Norway, look at Finland, look at France, look at Spain. These are all open societies which have managed to flatten the curve, to buy time for their healthcare systems as we move now into the more challenging period of this. And in this sense, Democracies are far from an ideal kind of government, but every alternative is far worse. I agree with Winston Churchill on that one.
Thank you. Louise Guay, would you like to ask your question? Which is, do you think teleworking will affect the change the real estate market?
There's a lot of speculation about that. You have to be careful here. Don't take what I say and don't make any decisions based on it. You go talk to the experts who really know local markets and understand. But if you look at the big cities in Canada, for example, and we have one example, Open Text, which is our largest digital company in Canada now, has offices all over the world and mostly in the downtowns of cities, just announced that it is closing 50% of its office space because of the high cost of commercial real estate in the downtown cores. And it's discovered that its workforce that is working from home is not significantly less productive. So it's developing a rotating strategy where it will bring in people 2 days a week, 2.5 days a week, and it will be able to reduce over time, certainly not right away, but over time, the cost of its commercial real estate. That is an entirely credible scenario that could result from this. What mitigates against that is, and again, all of you who are joining this webinar will have your own views on this. We hear two very different kinds of reactions. Some people are saying, I love working at home. As far as I'm concerned, if I never have to commute to my office again, that's just fine with me. The quality of work that I'm doing is better because I'm interrupted less. And then we have those who say, I hate this. I can't wait to go back to the office. I need the stimulation of my colleagues. And we know too that innovation and creativity usually flourishes when people are working together with their colleagues. So we're going to get a mixed system out of this. Just because everybody can work at home doesn't mean that that's the best system. But I think more people will work from home than did before this and will work digitally, and that will change the way commercial real estate is configured, especially in downtown cores, I think.
Thank you, Janice. Question from Bella Haas. Many regimes around the world are using the pandemic as an excuse to limit freedoms of expression and to concentrate power in their hands. Plus, there is the growing assertiveness of China. Are we seeing the decline of democracies around the world?
So here's another, that's a great question, Bella, thank you. And here's another example of where the pandemic has merely accelerated what was happening before. The decline of democracy started 15 years ago, and we measure that, and so we know. But again, the pandemic provides the pretext for governments to concentrate authority, to declare emergencies, to give themselves extraordinary powers, which often they don't give back. So I think you're talking about Hungary here. You must be alluding, I think, in part to Hungary, where Viktor Orban has used the crisis to do exactly that. In Poland, the story in Poland started long before COVID, where there were systematic attacks on judges and the independence of the judiciary. But that is, so all of that has accelerated. The 21st century has not been a good century for democracy. Generally, we've seen a retreat over the last 20 years, and interestingly enough, partly enabled by technology, by digital technology. When we first began to use the internet, there were wildly optimistic hopes that the internet was going to give every citizen a voice and enhance democracy. But technology has always been used for ill as well as for good. And when you look at the capacity of a government like China to watch its citizens and to track every movement, where they go, what they say, what they put on Weibo, which is the equivalent of Twitter in North America. We have a new version of the surveillance state, which has enabled the retreat of democracy and the push forward by autocrats. This is, I think, the big challenge for the next decade.
Thank you. Sophie Mielman is asking, there seems to be no explanation of how this guaranteed income and social services will be paid for and over how long? And how do we prevent capital flight of the wealthy who feel that they don't need the support to support those programs and are concerned about being on the hook for this, rightly or wrongly?
That's, those are big questions. Let me just talk about the concept behind a guaranteed annual income rather than this particular program, because the government is going to have to make this decision in the next 6 months. What the guaranteed annual income does is it is an alternative to all the existing support systems that we have now. And instead of a series of agencies that send individual payments to people for different things, it rolls up all together and provides whatever the amount that is thought to be appropriate in a single check to families and individuals that are at the poverty line or below. Is it more expensive than all the existing support systems? Yes, but by how much we don't know, because we actually have not done the actuarial work. Let's think a little bigger about this. If we now know that viruses of the kind that COVID is are especially lethal in poor communities in substandard housing. Can we think about this in a different way as a social investment that everybody makes to make sure that people have the bare minimum they need for decent housing and food? And it is, when you think about it again, the current payment is $2,000 a month. That's all it is. And that is a strategic investment that we make in order to prevent the kind of situation that we're facing right now. What this virus has done is shone a spotlight on all the underfunded sectors of our society. Top of mind, long-term care homes, which are shocking, frankly. We've all known, but they're shocking. Poor communities where people are crowded together in very dense living conditions is a second one. And I could go on. This is a natural experiment. People, and it's essentially interesting where support for guaranteed annual income comes from. It comes from two segments of our political spectrum. Of course, it comes from the liberals, from some liberals, but it also comes from conservatives who see it as an alternative to very large and expensive bureaucracies. We don't need those any longer. The money goes directly from the Department of Finance to families and individuals who get a check. So this is one of the biggest public policy decisions our government will make. It probably wanted to put that off for 5 or 10 years. It's smack in front of it right now.
Thank you. We have time for maybe 2 more questions. So
Sure,
this
yeah.
is a question. This is a question from Raquel. How do you account for the fact that in light of the horrific economic conditions looming, most people in Canada are passively accepting that governments are not even laying out a plan ahead of us? Is the Stockholm Syndrome setting in where people are grateful of its captures?
Well, let me just talk about myself. I think that government acted with dispatch and urgency to get money into the hands of Canadians and Canadian businesses who really needed it desperately, prevented even more layoffs than there, and it's huge, the unemployment rate as it is now, but have allowed businesses to stay open through this critical period. But is that a plan? No, it is not a plan. It's an emergency measure. And I think the pressure will, you're absolutely right to identify that as a problem. I think the pressure will grow on the government to come up with a plan. Now let's understand, whatever plan they come up with, some of us are not going to like. That's what plans are. They're about making hard choices. And the challenge is for our leadership to tell us why they made the hard choices and what they expect of us as we begin to work our way out of this really serious crisis.
Thank you. One final question from Dale Boydman. Will there be a change in our education system and the respect and salaries teachers are getting? Will the government better fund the public school system?
You would hope so, wouldn't you? Any of you who've had to homeschool your kids over these last 7 weeks, what I'm hearing from my children's friends is, oh my goodness, I had no idea how hard it is to be a teacher. And they're coming away with renewed respect for teachers. So add teachers to the segment of society, just like personal support care workers and grocery workers and emergency workers, that we come out with renewed respect. And I would hope that would translate into better pay.
Thank you very much, Professor Janice Stein. You did an incredible job today. Thank you for taking the time to share with us your thoughts about what the future may bring to us. Thank you to Ronnie Appleby for introducing our speaker and beginning the conversation. That was an interesting and captivating discussion. Before we say goodbye, I would like to remind you to join us next week when we meet with former head of Mossad, Ephraim Halevi. Same day, same time. Be safe and healthy and have a lovely, lovely Sunday.